morning, everyone, and welcome to our 9th webinar in the Volunteer Management webinar series. My name is Sydney Shuttro, and I am the Director of Volunteer Services at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. So I really appreciate everyone who's on today. We have some new people and some people who I think have been on almost every webinar in the series, so I do appreciate your support. This month, we are going to be talking about volunteer removal. So can you hire a volunteer? Yes or no? It's not a simple answer. We're going to talk about all the complexities today. I always like to start the webinars off by saying I am not a volunteer expert, though I am working on it. It's part of my job that I love. I'm happy I've been able to build more of a career off of it. And I love doing all the research and learning more and more every day. So I appreciate you all having the faith in me to help expand some of your knowledge on volunteer management. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be posted publicly on the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disabilities YouTube channel. So as we talk about different things, we are going to talk about some volunteer experiences, so just be sure that we don't use names or anything like that. We want to keep it as anonymous as possible. And without further ado, let's get started. So we always start our webinars off with a recruitment tip of the month, as it was a very popular topic. So this month, I do want to emphasize the importance of our local and county chambers of commerce. Has some really, really successful work with the local chambers in recruiting volunteers. So they are one of the biggest agencies with the largest networks in either your local community or county, depending on how that works in your area. They have connections to so many businesses, and they can help not only find volunteers for you, but maybe if you're looking for fundraising opportunities, they may be able to help you find some local sponsors or even some individuals to donate materials if you're looking for some donations for programs. They have multimedia connections in the community, so they're able to not only reach out to their business contacts that they have through the chamber, but also the community as a whole. Many have newsletters that they send out either weekly or monthly, multiple social media accounts on all of those different platforms, and a lot of different connections with local media outlets such as newspapers, TV, radio, things like that. It is extremely important to find a person as a contact at your chamber and keep them updated on things that are going on in your program. So they could either help promote maybe the volunteer opportunities, they could help promote a training coming up, they may be able to use their social media accounts to help you do a post if you send them the materials, or a lot of the social media pages for the chambers allow the community to post their own requests. Someone at kind of a caution to this suggestion is someone at your agency may already have a contact at your local chamber of commerce. So before you go into kind of doing your research and reaching out, make sure you're not stepping on anybody's toes who may already have a contact, and that could just confuse the chamber itself, just saying, oh, well, I already talked to so-and-so at your agency. Do I need to talk to multiple people? Maybe having one primary contact is the best way to go, so that way it doesn't jeopardize any relationships that have already been cultivated. I have also been able to find a list of all of the chambers of commerces in Tennessee. So again, these could be city chambers or they could be county chambers. So if you're interested in getting this partnership developed and pursue it toward part of your volunteer recruitment plan in the future, hopefully that'll be a good resource for you to make it a little bit easier to find who you need to contact. Before we get started on our topic, volunteer removal and can you fire a volunteer, well, really this month and a couple other months, next month in particular, we're going to talk a lot about policies and procedures and more of the complex aspects of volunteer engagement. So it's really, really vitally important that whatever we discuss, like I always say, I don't have the power to force you to implement any of these suggestions or best practices. That's all that they are, just suggestions to improve. So especially when we talk about possibly removal of a volunteer or any new policies or procedures, It's vitally important that you include either your legal team at your agency, definitely your supervisor, or maybe if you don't have a legal team or you are the director and maybe you're your own supervisor, include your board of directors in the conversation, or at least make them aware of any changes that are coming up. So it's important to especially get their feedback and make sure that you're doing everything within the scope of the agency as a whole that you're working for. And many of you probably are already going to have these policies in place, and these next couple of months are just going to be maybe suggestions on how to tweak something you already have in place. So before we get started, I mentioned before we started the recording that we're going to do some polling today. So I'm hoping everyone can open up their chat box. I'm going to put a poll up just so we can gauge. I'm curious if anyone, not if you've been fired, but if anyone has had experience in having to remove a volunteer before. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the poll. So you should see this in your chat box. We have about 30 people, so I'm hoping that we can get some good responses. Here we go. We got people who are responding already. So let me know yes or no if you've had experience with firing a volunteer before. Okay. Getting quite a few responses. This is really great. Keep going, guys. I'm going to go ahead and start to close the poll. I think that gives you about 20 more seconds. We're almost at 100% participation. Thank you, everybody. So it's looking like we're almost at 50-50. This is interesting. I myself have had experience with having to remove a volunteer. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and save these results real quick. I apologize. So our results show, and I apologize, I don't know how to show you guys the polling results just yet. So I will include that in the follow-up email, but just so everyone knows, we were almost at 50-50. So we had 24 of the 30 people who were on the webinar respond. 10 individuals said yes, they have some experience in removal of volunteers, and 14 people said no, they have no experience. I mentioned I do have an experience with volunteer removal, not with our programs that I work for here at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. This was in a volunteer role where I had to work to remove a fellow volunteer. I was the president of a board of directors, and there was actually 2 other board members. There was a policy, and everyone signed it, that you have to attend at least 2 of the 4 board meetings a year, or else you will be asked to leave. And they did not meet that requirement, so we had to, of course, have discussions with them after every board meeting, making sure they were okay, and then let them know, hey, if you don't attend this next board meeting, you will be asked to leave the board, and unfortunately, that's what had to happen. So I'm curious if anyone's willing to share, of course, no specifics, but and I'll do my best to share what's in the chat box. But if anyone wants to share their experience, I'd be interested in reading about it, maybe possibly sharing. If not, we'll do that at a later time. So thank you all for participating in that. So I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to answer the question right off the bat. That's why you're here. So I'm going to answer the question, but that doesn't mean to leave the webinar. We still have a lot more to discuss. But answering the question, can you fire a volunteer? In short, yes, you can. However, it should never, and I really stress this, never be the first option that you consider. There are definitely reasons for immediate termination, and we're going to talk about those. But hopefully, if you're having an issue with a volunteer, asking them to leave the program is not the first thing that pops into your mind. In fact, we want the removal of a volunteer to be the last resort after you've exhausted many other options to try and keep that volunteer engaged. So we are going to focus a majority of this presentation on some difficult behaviors that we may see in some of our volunteers, how to counteract those negative and difficult behaviors to make them become hopefully more positive, some alternatives and steps to keep our volunteers and prevent them from being removed. And then we'll talk a little bit on if a removal is in the cards some positive ways to try and make that a little less stressful for everyone. So we're going to start with the beginning of our volunteer process. So prevention is really going to help you avoid any type of removal of volunteers. And what do I mean in prevention? The first thing is our volunteer screening process. So we can try and screen these individuals out to avoid the removal process from the beginning. This is all definitely easier said than done. We'll throw that out there as well. But our background screenings, reference checks, interviews are just the starting point to see if a volunteer is a good fit, especially for those of us who may not do a more in-depth volunteer interview. It may be a good idea to add some questions when someone says they want to volunteer for the program. We're going to talk about some difficult behaviors, so you may be thinking of some questions as we talk about this, but maybe some scenario or behavioral questions in those interviews to see how they would react to certain situations. I can hear everyone's sighs. I can almost see everyone's eyes rolling because I talk about volunteer role descriptions constantly. And I know you're all thinking, she's going to talk about this again. It's going to be every webinar. I think I didn't mention it on one webinar, but it's going to be a continuing theme from me. But this document sets the tone for what we need to accomplish for our mission and our goals of the program. So when it comes to trying to prevent some of these difficult behaviors, the volunteer role description is really going to help that. It's going to set those expectations to hopefully counteract some of those negatives and turn them into some positives. Our orientation and training, orientation in particular, is extremely important to discuss any type of volunteer removal. So telling the volunteers up front at the orientation or the training, removal is an option. You're not guaranteed to stay as a volunteer in our program for as long as you want if we see some issues that are arising. So it's important to have the volunteers know that, okay, well, there is a possibility if I do something wrong, I could be removed. So take time to go over the steps. You know, take time to go over these are the things that will cause us to have immediate termination of a volunteer. Again, we're going to talk about those here in a little bit. But if we see some issues, kind of what steps are you all willing to take? It may be we do additional training. We may look at a new volunteer assignment, kind of lay that out, maybe in as much detail to not overwhelm them as possible. And reiterate this from your orientation into your initial training. And it may be a good idea to even have an annual update or during your update trainings, if you have them on a regular basis, maybe add, hey, don't forget about this policy, don't forget about this aspect of your role, just kind of as a reminder and a refresher, especially if there may be an issue that's arising to kind of try and nip it in the bud. We're going to discuss this next item, the volunteer handbook, more in depth next month. But a handbook is a really important document to have in place if you don't have one already. It doesn't have to be long, but it needs to be as comprehensive as you can get. So I've helped create a handbook in the past, and it does really help set those expectations clearly to the volunteers. It is about 36 pages, which is extremely long, I know, but it really does help. Even if the volunteer says they read it, we require them to sign it. We hope that they read it. We point out the specific topics to kind of drill home, the confidentiality, the conflict of interest, things of that nature. But it's really important that if you do have a volunteer handbook, that the volunteer signs it before they're able to be placed in a volunteer role. And in the program that I helped create a volunteer handbook for, luckily with guidance through the grant funder that we had, really helped in putting that together. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been any major issues in needing to remove a volunteer from that program. So we did have a question of, will you send a copy of that volunteer handbook? That particular volunteer handbook, I'm going to work with the director of the program to get permission to share that. I don't think it will be an issue, but I do want to get his permission before I send it out. And it's definitely going to be a point that we're going to drill home next month. So if I don't send it out, with this presentation. It's not that I don't think it's valuable, it is extremely valuable, but we're really going to hit it home next month. Great question, and you will get it eventually, I'm sure. All right, before we consider removal, there are some things that we have to have in place. So we got to have our, I used to love this saying and now it's kind of getting a little old, but to be cliche, we have to have our ducks in a row. So the first thing you have to have is kind of the documentation, the justification for why you're considering removing this volunteer from the program. Every volunteer, as I'm sure you all already have in place, should either have a hard copy paper file, maybe a file online, or an electronic file, or both, depending. But everyone needs to have an individual file for their volunteers. This is going to have information like their volunteer application, their background check, any compliments or complaints, any reporting that they do. So that way, if you have something for an individual volunteer, you already know where you can find all that information. You also need to include the volunteer role description in that file. So that way you have, okay, these are the expectations, here's the documentations of why they're not meeting those expectations, or incident reports or something along those lines. If you hear of any complaints or compliments from staff, clients, or other volunteers, they need to be recorded. So especially any complaints or concerns, it's extremely important that you get both sides of the story. So I've had some clients say, you know, I talked to a volunteer and they were very rude or said something inappropriate. So I would talk to the client and get their side of the story, call the volunteer, get their side of the story, just to make sure it's not one-sided. And some of our calls are recorded in certain areas, so we're able to actually hear the conversation, which is helpful. I know a lot of us don't have that capability. And also make sure that you document any kind of notes. It doesn't have to be a word-for-word transcript of the conversation, but just a few high notes from the conversation. Make sure you date it so you know when the conversation occurred, what time. If you can do the time, I think that would be helpful. And it just shows that you tried to resolve the issue or at least get all the details in a timely and professional manner. You do need some time to investigate if there is a complaint or a concern. So something that new that I read in the research that I hadn't considered that I'm going to look into is a suspension policy. So not immediate termination, but just we need a few days to look at what happened. So this comes into play more when there could be a reason for immediate termination. It gives you the opportunity to tell the person, instead of firing them on the spot or saying, you know, you're no longer welcome here as a volunteer. Hey, we noticed that this just happened. You said an inappropriate joke. We saw this, that, and the other, whatever the situation may be. I think it would be appropriate for you to leave your volunteer role for today. I think it's okay for you to go home early, and I'm going to follow up with you after we get some more information about what happened. I'm going to call you, get your side, and hear everything that you have to say about the situation. But it's not automatic termination. It gives both parties the time to kind of cool down, analyze the situation. But it is important to keep in touch with that volunteer and let them know a review is happening, maybe within a week or so. And you may set up a different policy. We're going to have a sit-down talk. So we're going to do this in person and talk about next steps. It's important to know also for some minor infractions, like, you know, showing up 10 minutes late to a shift or maybe filing papers incorrectly, that's not grounds for, you know, a suspension or immediate termination. So a suspension policy, if it's something that you want to put in place, is more for more serious infractions. Again, I'm going to say this a lot. You guys are probably going to get sick and tired of me saying it, but you need to include your supervisor, and possibly if you have a legal team, they need to be informed on if you're having a problem with a volunteer. So minimally, your supervisor needs to know. Keep them in the loop. It's going to help in the long run. So it's not going to be something that's just going to come out of the blue. So just think if you went to your supervisor and said, hey, I'm having a problem with this volunteer for months and I just can't take it anymore. I need you to help me figure out how to, tell them that they can't volunteer anymore. Well, if I'm the supervisor, and I know we have many supervisors on the webinar today, I would be like, whoa, why wasn't I told about this, from the start? We could have done so many different kind of possible remedies. So making sure that you have good communication with your supervisors and your legal teams if any issues are happening. Then you also need to talk with your supervisor, possibly bring in the legal team again. One other thing before I go to that, sorry. Last month we talked about how we spend 5 times more money and time in recruiting new volunteers than trying to work to retain the current ones. Having this investigation, this documentation, these discussions with your supervisors, legal team if needed, is a really good retention strategy to retain your volunteers instead of spending that time recruiting new ones, trying to not fix, but work with a current volunteer to make their experience with the volunteer program and yours better. So lastly, you do have to make a decision along with your supervisor, if possible, just to keep them in the loop, like I said. It may be a major infraction that is grounds for immediate removal, and you'll work with your supervisor to figure out those steps. Hopefully, after reviewing the documents and discussing it with everybody, there will be an alternative plan of correction to help the volunteer and the program be more successful, and we're going to talk about some of those corrective actions. And remember, removal of a volunteer should be the last resort after all of the other options have been exhausted. So there are some zero tolerance. These are things we're absolutely not going to tolerate for a volunteer. This also, a lot of people may adapt some of their immediate termination policies from their employer into this. I do see someone's hand is raised. Feel free to type any questions into the chat box and I will look over them as I go through, so I apologize for that. So I'm just going to put a few of the possible reasons, and we'll talk about them, for immediate termination of a volunteer. It is sort of a zero tolerance. These are good things to have that suspension policy for. So if it is broken confidentiality, can you prove that it was broken confidentiality? Is there documentation to support that? You don't want to hire someone for something that's zero tolerance and then find out, oh, it actually didn't happen. I just assumed that it happened. So definitely keep that in mind. You also never want to make a scene in front of clients, staff, or other volunteers. So asking, again, the volunteer maybe to go home for the day is going to be a better option than saying that they're terminated right there on site. A lot of this information is put into the volunteer agreement or your volunteer handbook that we talked about a little bit earlier, and we're going to talk about more next month. So this is an important piece of information, again, to talk during the volunteer orientation. It's a way for volunteers to kind of self-determine if they want to be in the program, if the program's right for them or not. So in some cases, through the research, the orientation is really, and when you talk about possible reasons for termination, the volunteers' rights and responsibilities, those are really what the individual looks at during the orientation and says, is this going to be a good fit for me or not? So it almost screens them out themselves before asking them to come to an initial training and put some more time and effort into training those individuals. This is, again, is extremely important to talk to with your legal team, especially, and make sure that they agree with the reasons for immediate termination, or maybe they have additional suggestions of things that you should consider. So, you know, illegal, unethical, unsafe acts, any type of abuse, theft, volunteering while under the influence. Those are things that we may consider a zero tolerance for reasons a volunteer should be removed from the program. I promise we're going to talk about positivity, positive things, alternatives and steps and things like that. I don't like to be so negative when it comes to volunteers. However, I do think it's really important for us to talk about common behaviors, difficult behaviors in particular, that may come up when we work with volunteers. You can maybe able to relate this not only to volunteers, but people in your personal and professional life. So to help get on the positive path, even though we're talking about a little bit of the negative component, is we're going to talk about the difficult behaviors, kind of the characteristics, maybe some consequences, but also maybe ways to deal with it to help improve the behavior so they don't rub us, our coworkers, clients, or even other volunteers the wrong way. So we have 8 difficult behaviors that we're going to discuss. The first is the know-it-all. Then we have the sabotagers, the gossips, the rule breakers, the negative ones, the social climbers, the harassers, and the prejudiced ones. So we're going to talk about all 8 of these. And the source that I got them from is down here at the bottom. Kind of a funny name for a book, but it's The Complete Idiot's Guide to Recruiting and Managing Volunteers. They do say at the beginning, no, you're not an idiot. It's kind of like the, Computers for Dummies, I think is what they were trying to go for. But it's a really great book. I do recommend it, and that's where I'm getting a lot of this information. So, sounded like someone came in an airplane. Sorry about that. So the first group that we're going to talk about is the know-it-alls. So welcome to the Know-It-All Show. These individuals have the answers to everything and can tell you everything you're doing wrong in a short amount of time of being with the program. They do sometimes have really good suggestions, but the way that they communicate to us turns off our listening completely almost. So the volunteer themselves could become isolated from staff and other volunteers. So it also may be hard for other volunteers to express themselves with ideas for fear of negative feedback from those individuals. But how are ways that we can still include those volunteers is you definitely want to confront it at the beginning or it's going to continue to get worse. So we'll have, they do have valuable input, and it's important to let them know that you appreciate their enthusiasm, but their ideas are getting lost because they're coming on too strong. So trying to help them maybe verbalize their ideas in a more positive way. A way to engage these individuals is to maybe have them do solo projects or projects in a small team, possibly asking for their input on elements of training or other ways to improve the program. The know-it-all is probably the volunteer that I've worked with in my experience the most. I'm creeping up on 11 years, almost 13, working with volunteers in both volunteer and professional capacity. So this is the one that I've experienced the most. And from my work with them, I've found that they're really helpful when it comes to kind of training content review and maybe updating some training materials. They're really good with grammar and editing. And even being a trainer to possibly present to other volunteers. You do want to ease that part slowly with them because you want to make sure that they know the parameters and they don't go into too much detail. They've been with the program for a while and they know all the ins and outs, but we want to keep it basic in general. The last thing we want to do is overwhelm a volunteer on their first day. So those are some ways to possibly help with the know-it-alls. Our next group that we're going to talk about, and feel free to type into the chat box if you've had similar experiences or want to share some stories as well. So the next we have is the sabotagers. For whatever reason, probably no one knows, not even the sabotager, these individuals feel best when someone or something else fails. So it's fortunate for our volunteer programs that this behavior is fairly rare, and hopefully you all feel that way too, but it is possible to see. So Many of these sabotagers come to the program ready and enthusiastic, but sometimes one of the kind of tips to see if you have a sabotager in your midst is they like to overcommit and make promises that they may not be able to keep. But when the rubber hits the road and it's time to do the work, they tend to either undermine, miss deadlines, have sloppy work, and again, make promises that they really never intended to keep. So even deeper, if they talk, or they could potentially talk badly behind someone's back and blame that person or maybe even you for their failures and withhold information that they have that's important to complete the task successfully. So if we don't spot this behavior soon enough, it can cause us to miss deadlines that could trickle down to affecting volunteers, other clients, the programs as a whole. So and they also do tend to undermine the reputation of other volunteers for their lack of commitment and follow through. So for those of us who may have trouble with buy-in of our supervisors and our coworkers, the sabotagers are basically, could be one of the reasons why they have the mindset that they do, kind of the one rotten apple spoils the whole bunch kind of mentality. See, I told you volunteers weren't worth the time. They're not going to be able to do, keep their commitments and things of that nature. So we want to try and prevent sabotagers for sure. The best prevention is the best approach. Again, that's easy, way easier said than done, but really trust your gut. If you have an interview with a volunteer and something just doesn't sound right, or if the volunteer comes on too strong or they're making too many promises at the beginning, I really want to help with this fundraiser. I think we could really be great and we could get this ballroom and I have so many connections in the community and I can get so many donations and this is our fundraising goal. And they really don't have a background in fundraising or what they're promising. That could be a red flag. Some of us may include this in our applications already, like I mentioned before, but reference checks are a really good screening tool to kind of rule out the sabotagers. We're not going to be the only programs that they've tried to sabotage. So they're going to have kind of leave a path or a trail of things that they've done with other organizations that you might be able to say, well, if they do that with that previous volunteer opportunity, they might bring it to our program as well. So we want to try and, again, nip that in the bud if we can. Another way, try and start them off with small assignments. You know, they do want to commit. You think that they're really wanting to help, but you don't want to give them something necessarily that's going to be detrimental to the program. Like, hey, we need this report for our grant review that's coming up here. We can have you work on this. Give them small assignments, small responsibilities that aren't going to completely derail something that is really important. The gossips. This may be the most common, just human behavior. So we're not only going to see this in our volunteers, but we may just see it in people in general. If you say you're not a gossip, you might be a gossip. I am ashamed to admit that I have gossiped before. I'm working on it, but we want to try and avoid including gossips in our program. So these are the people who spread rumors about others, and particularly when there's either times of turmoil, change, confusion. That's when you really see the gossipers come out. They can cause a major decrease in organizational morale depending on who the gossiper is talking to and what they're talking about. So this may also affect the trust volunteers have built with you or that they've built with each other. So if the gossip is something about you and it gets around to the other volunteers, that may cause some mistrust. Some of our volunteers, and I do this as well, become our friends outside of the volunteer world. Maybe we've added them on our social media accounts or something along those lines. So I do caution you, if you are friends with volunteers, maybe on social media or outside of volunteering, that you be more cautious about what you post, personally and professionally. So this is just a rule of thumb anyway. Don't, post negatively about your job, or else that could be one of the things that the gossipers start to spread. Oh, she's really, or he's really not happy with this, this, and this. Did you see that post? Oh, you should become, Facebook friends with him or her and really figure out how she really feels about things. So you want to be cautious of that. So gossipers have more influence if people think you or your organization is hiding something. So clear, consistent communication is definitely going to help counter any rumors that spread. So when change is coming, or something different's going to come, it possibly could have happened during COVID, when that volunteers are coming back and there's going to be a lot of changes in policy. Masks are going to have to be worn, and certain other protocols that we have in place. So be sure that you're always available to talk, or have certain times that you're able to talk to volunteers, kind of have that schedule with them to talk or answer any questions about the changes. The more the volunteers trust you, the more they can debunk any gossip, and even maybe help you find out who the gossipers are, so you can talk to them one-on-one and say, hey, I just want to make sure that you understand these changes that are coming on, and not say, hey, I know you're gossiping about me, but hey, do you understand, why these changes are in place? I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, kind of a thing. If the situation gets out of control, a message to all the volunteer base, or even a training to all volunteers may be needed, to remind everyone that respecting the personal lives of staff, volunteers, clients, and the organization as a whole is part of the volunteer agreement they signed and needs to be upheld. So trying not to call anyone out, but letting it know that, hey, we know something's going on, we're trying to resolve the issue. Next are the rule breakers. Every rule is made to be broken. So these individuals tend to ignore organizational policy and duties in their volunteer role descriptions. They have the I've never met a rule I can't break kind of mentality, and may want to volunteer, almost ironically, to work on creating policies and guidelines for the future. Will they follow their own guidelines? Something to find out. Ultimately, we as volunteer coordinators or managers, or whatever your title may be, as you work with volunteers, we're responsible for the actions of our volunteers. So we spend a lot of time creating these policies and role descriptions to make sure the needs are clearly defined, and volunteers may even possibly improve upon our volunteer role descriptions. However, allowing them to improve on the role does not mean that it's in the basic, kind of the bare bones of our volunteer role description is intended not to be followed or even just ignored. It could also cause problems with other volunteers as they see, okay, well, I agreed that we can't do this, this, and this, but this person is always breaking this rule, or they're not doing what they're supposed to do regularly. Why are they getting away with it and I would get in trouble? Or maybe, hey, if they can do this and not get in trouble, well, maybe I'll just do it too if they do shortcuts or something along those lines. So it could have a trickle-down effect. And you never want volunteers to follow that behavior or even become resentful if you let those behaviors slide. So similar to know-it-alls, you have to, if you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and it's only going to grow worse and worse. So luckily, rule breakers do tend to be more approachable than know-it-alls. So if you speak to them discreetly, not in front of a whole group, directly and with mutual respect, they typically understand, and the behavior can be remedied. These volunteers are a prime reason, again, why the volunteer role descriptions are so vitally important to the program. I think just after doing these webinar series, I've probably updated my volunteer role descriptions about 4 times, just kind of thinking about all of these different things. So the negative ones. I love this cartoon. I think it's great whenever we're working with someone who's kind of more negative. The heart is saying, look at all this good, but the brain is just focused on that one little bad thing that's happening. And that's kind of a good depiction of what the negative ones can kind of come off like. So nothing is done correctly and never will be done right with these volunteers. So don't take it personally, because it's not just you that they feel is doing nothing right. It's in nearly every aspect of their life. It's kind of part of their personality and mentality. Like many of us, this group does not like change, but it's also kind of funny because they really don't like the status quo either. So it's a lose-lose almost. And this group actually is probably a volunteer that becomes our most loyal, and many of our long-term volunteers can sometimes exhibit this difficult behavior. Sometimes, not always. So there's not necessarily a major impact on the organization or program as we relate to but we can all relate to being around a negative person. It just brings down morale. We want to keep the morale up. They can make it difficult to start a new program or make changes to an existing program or strategy. The best case scenario is they can kind of be a nuisance. But worst case scenario, they may drive people away and also prevent programs from moving forward if they're not talked with or worked with one-on-one. So one of the best ways to deal with this group is to almost kind of sort of kill them with kindness. Stay positive as you can. Don't get caught up in their negativity. Focus on the future and kind of all the positive things that are going to come down the pipe because of these new changes that are coming around. Having this personality type probably is not the best volunteer to do any type of public speaking. You may not want them at an information fair or a booth at an event. But they're also some of your better volunteers that actually get the work done, so it's a little bit tricky. Try and team them up with someone who's more positive, or maybe a group of more positive volunteers that can kind of counteract their negativity. While their input may bring down the conversation, it's really important that we listen to them, because some of their concerns may be legitimate as we develop a planning process to do maybe new programs. So they could have some really vital concerns or legitimate concerns as we work to moving our programs forward. Their presentation and how they say it may cause us to kind of turn off our listening skills. Next, we have the social climbers. So this group cares more about the position that they hold and their status in the organization more than really the cause or the mission of the organization. They like the highly recognizable leadership positions and enjoy the publicity and recognition of doing the work. These volunteers are often really well connected and can be inspiring, and tend to combine their volunteer work with some financial contributions. And they have the ability, like I said, to inspire others to support your organization in the program. That's not bad, right? If it gets too out of control, they may get carried away with certain things. So these volunteers can be effective if their powers are used for good. Clear expectations are extremely important. Be sure you're included in the decision making, because some decisions that the social climbers may make may benefit them personally more than it would benefit the program or the volunteer effort. A conflict of interest policy in combination with those clear expectations is a really great way to rein in some of the obstacles that may come with a social climber. So making sure you set those limits and not jeopardize the organization's integrity. Be sure that you're in on the decision making, so that way they make decisions for the organization and not for themselves. And the volunteer tends to be active in the up and coming or the it causes in their community that are really high profile. So while there are some challenges with this group, we can really benefit from having potentially some of the characteristics of the social climbers in our volunteer programs. We just have to make sure that those expectations and those limits are set, so that they can bring in their networks of people to help increase our networks, it really is a win-win if we can get them to use their powers, so to speak, for good. The harassers, we got 2 more groups left, and then we're going to do some more polls. So this group is a combination of know-it-alls and sabotagers with a more intense approach to getting their way. So intimidation and aggression are strategies that they often use, such as calling people at home. This could be clients, other volunteers, other staff, invading personal space, and even sometimes yelling. They feel more power. The more power they can get, they threaten to withhold support, whether that be financially or even in some of the volunteer service that they know is vital that we need to have a successful program. We did have a question come in. Do you have access to a good conflict of interest statement? I have multiple examples of conflict of interest statements, and I'm happy to share those. Again, that's another topic that we will discuss next month as well. So I think I might have flip-flopped these 2 topics. I probably should have done policies and procedures before the firing webinar. So I apologize. I'm kind of ahead of the game in terms of topics. But yes, I can get you those for sure. So some consequences with having harassers in our programs is their mentality of my way or the highway really does not work in a volunteer-based program. If this group is not addressed, in an extreme case, violence may be a tactic that they use, and it's extremely rare, but if it happens on the rare occasion, it's extremely hard to bounce back from to either recruit more volunteers or even recover if it becomes public for your agency. This is probably one of the zero tolerance aspects of volunteer removal. So this behavior should never be tolerated. You may decide that this is grounds, again, for termination, but that's possibly where that suspension policy comes in. Hey, we noticed this, we need you to leave for the day and cool off. And you talk with your legal team on, this was a serious infraction. Do you all support me in possibly removing this volunteer? You need to explain, especially why the behavior is inappropriate. And then documentation is key as well to even show a pattern of the behavior if you decide to give the volunteer a second chance, depending on what behavior that they use. The last difficult behavior we're going to talk about is the prejudiced ones. So people can hold prejudices for many different things: race, age, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, social status, religion, the list goes on and on. Research shows that these prejudices are typically learned from experiences in childhood or from a role model who raised us. Most of us are able to put our own prejudices aside and treat others equally and respectfully in any situation. However, we may experience a volunteer who freely shares their prejudices by telling an inappropriate joke, using slurs, or degrading others for being different. These moments, and this may be hard to screen out because these moments tend to come extremely out of the blue and catch us way off guard. We never knew this volunteer felt this way, and it's just randomly they decide to say this inappropriate joke or this slur, and it just, everyone's almost in shock. Like, did I just hear what I think I just heard? So it's definitely a serious matter that has to be taken extremely seriously because it may cause other volunteers or even some staff, depending on what is said, to leave the organization. Worst case scenario, you could face a lawsuit. Now, of course, I'm not a legal person. I'm not a legal expert. This is, again, why I stress that you need to include your legal team in all of these discussions, and especially let them know if something along these lines, something inappropriate was said, they have to be notified immediately so they can help you figure out what to do. Some ways to deal with this behavior: make sure you have an anti-discrimination policy in place. Most of our volunteer programs adopt our agency-wide policy. If a comment or a joke is ever made, we need to address it right away. You may have a little bit of a out-of-body experience, or your heart stops and like, whoa, did I hear what I just think I heard, but it needs to be, we can't hesitate, even though we're kind of in a state of shock almost. We have to address it right away. As we're addressing it with the volunteer, again, pull them aside, don't make a public spectacle of it. If the volunteer gets defensive, like, oh, it was only a joke, calm down, doesn't really mean anything, you know, you have no sense of humor, you can explain, of course, why it's a problem. And that is a major clue to consider for removing the person from the program. If they're not going to take it seriously and they really don't understand how offensive what they said was, that's a red flag. However, if the volunteer shows remorse and apologizes, a warning may be in order and corrective action can be discussed. So again, bring in your legal team on that one. Maybe a diversity or inclusion training for all volunteers would be appropriate. That's also something that should be incorporated in your orientation, definitely your initial training, some diversity and inclusion training. Again, make sure you document what happened and you put it in their volunteer file. So we just talked about our 8 difficult behaviors. So I am curious, we're gonna do another poll. After talking about these behaviors, I know we think and we know all of our volunteers are wonderful in so many ways, but maybe as we were talking, a couple of behaviors may have stuck out. Someone can be a know-it-all and still be a really great volunteer. So my first question to you that I'm going to open up the poll for, so the poll is open. Which difficult behavior that we just discussed have you seen the most in your volunteer experience with your program? So we're getting a couple people in progress, so I'm hoping, there we go, we got some people. So is it a know-it-all, a sabotager, a gossip, a rule breaker, a negative one, social climber, harasser, or prejudiced one? We're getting a few more people. All right, we're getting more response. Quite a few know-it-alls. I'm in that group. Social climbers, okay. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So you have about 20 seconds left. Or it might actually just be. All right. So as we close the poll, again, I apologize. I'm not able to figure out how to show you guys these results, but I will update the slides. So a majority of us, 9 of the 33 people who've joined us today, said know-it-alls are the most difficult. They're the behaviors that they see the most in their current volunteer workforce or in their experience with their program. I shouldn't say the current volunteer workforce, just in their overall experience. And a lot of us have different kinds of experience, right? We talked about this at our very first webinar. A lot of people have less than 2 years of experience working with volunteers, and then we have some who have 10 years or more. So 9 people said know-it-all. The next is the gossips. We have 7 people who said gossip. 3 people said the negative ones. And then sabotagers, rule breakers, and social climbers both have 2 individuals who said that was the volunteer group that, or the behavior that they see most. Okay, so last poll for today. What is the volunteer behavior that you've seen the least? And I'm going to go ahead and open that poll now. So have you seen know-it-all, sabotagers, gossip, rule breakers, negative ones, social climbers, harassers, or prejudiced ones as the least difficult behavior? But man, I cannot talk. The difficult behavior that you've seen the least in your volunteer experience with your program or programs, if you've dealt with more than one. All right, I kind of figured this. Yeah, we're seeing a majority of respondents are saying harassers and prejudiced ones are the ones that we see the least, which is great. That's what I was hoping for. So I'm going to go ahead and give you about 5 more seconds to participate. All right, and we'll go ahead and close the poll. So like I said, we had the most 10 individuals said the harassers are the least, or the difficult behavior that they see the least, with 10. The prejudiced ones, 8. Sabotagers, 2. And then know-it-alls, gossips, negative ones, and social climbers each had one person respond. Okay, that's about what I thought it would be. So I appreciate you guys participating, saving these results. Okay, excellent. So let's talk about the healthy ways that we can work with a difficult volunteer. So the first thing we need to do is define the issue. We need to understand the issue accurately and not have any assumptions. It may be helpful to bring in another person who's familiar with the issue or discuss how to handle it with your supervisor. It's important not to confuse this with gossiping. If you talk with your supervisor and you don't want to become a gossip, talk to another coworker, I can't believe that this volunteer is doing this, this, and this. You don't want to become the gossip, but if you talk with your supervisor and ask for advice, that's really getting more support than gossiping. So there is a difference between those two. Talking to someone you trust is a form, again, of support. A couple things to consider to helping define the issue. Is it a character issue? Like, is it a moral judgment? Do they have a strong work ethic and maybe it's getting a little too intense? Or can they be trusted or not? Competency issue. Do they lack the skills and knowledge of the role or their responsibility or their duty? And a chemistry issue. Is it just that the person's not a right fit in their role? Maybe they just don't work well with the individual that we partnered them with or the group that they're with? Are those aspects of the issue? If there is anything, or is there anything we've done wrong? So the issue may be something we might have accidentally done, unintentionally, of course, but maybe we didn't explain something well enough in training, or maybe we said something in a bad way and we need to reword some things that we've said. They're trying to really define the issue on what's going on. Separate the person from the problem. That's kind of hard because we just talked a lot about difficult behaviors, but we need to not necessarily define the issue as that behavior, or at least being the main issue of the problem. Affirmation is a good strategy. So none of us would ever say something out loud, at least hopefully we wouldn't say this. Something like, oh, he's just a bad volunteer, just terrible. Instead, try and think of it as he or she is doing really good work in a certain area, but is struggling in another. So they could be really good at one aspect and just struggling in another, and that could be one of the reasons why they're a little bit more difficult to work with. You really want to be good in this one area, and they're just not understanding it. Go direct. You don't want to beat around the bush. If you want a healthy way to work with these volunteers, you really have to go direct and be very specific. So it's best to do this as a face-to-face meeting, and I understand with COVID that can be difficult, so at least make it a phone call. An email is not going to cut it in a situation in trying to remedy the actions or the behaviors of a difficult volunteer. There is a strategy called an affirmation sandwich, where you start with the positive, then kind of address the issue, and then end positively. And it may kind of sound like it's downplaying a potentially serious problem, but it will really make you and the volunteer more comfortable and open in your communication and avoid being any maybe confrontational as you're trying to address an issue. So for an example, let's say you have a volunteer who's really struggling with reporting crucial data that you need for the program. So just a random name, not trying to call anyone out in particular. So let's say I have a meeting. Mary, we've noticed that you're doing great work with helping people we serve get the services that they need. We even received an email last week from someone that you helped, and it was just really encouraging to see. I do need to talk to you today about ways that we can help you report the amazing work that you're doing. The data is so important for so many reasons, like tracking trends. Sorry, headset just fell out. So tracking our data is important for so many reasons, like finding trends for maybe additional services that we need, or even to help with our grant funding to ensure sustainability for our program. Let's work together to see if we can find an easier way for you to report your volunteer activity. I know we can find a way to record your great work and it not feel like an additional burden to you and to your busy schedule. So started positive, she's doing great, address the issue of the reporting. And even though we're trying to find a remedy, that would maybe best for her and fit her schedule, because that may be part of the issue. Is she works 50 hours a week, and when she goes home, she just wants to relax and be with the family. She doesn't want to do another volunteer report. So try and doing that affirmation sandwich really helps. Follow up. Just because you have the conversation doesn't mean automatically the issue is resolved, and doesn't mean the relationship with the volunteer stops. So this happens a lot when we don't separate the volunteer from the problem. We think that we had the conversation, and if nothing changes, oh well, we did our job, and we fall back into a pattern of just ignoring the problem. We can't ignore the problems. They only get worse if we ignore them. So remember to deal with the problem, but also care for the person. Check in, grab a coffee, set up a Zoom or a FaceTime call, let them know you're still there for them, and the conversation was not a deal breaker for their volunteer work. And you're not upset. That's another thing that they really need to know, is you still support them in their volunteer efforts with the program. And lastly, you need to evaluate their progress and see if the behavior is improving or if they're doing anything different to help make the difficult behavior go away. So your volunteer was having trouble reporting their activity, and after your talk, you found a better way. Has it been consistent? Has the volunteer reported consistently for the last 6 months? If not, you may need another meeting, or maybe try and figure out other next steps to try and resolve the problem. All right, we have 6 remedies before removal. So one remedy, as you're trying to work with the volunteers, and again, as we said from the beginning, removing a volunteer from your program should be the last resort. So some remedies to consider are re-supervising the volunteer. If someone's having an issue following the rules or getting a task completed, they may need to be supervised a little bit stronger. That is going to put potentially more work on you, but if we want the volunteer to be successful, like we said, and we want to retain them, we do need to put possibly some additional effort into some of our volunteers. This person may need to be, I hate using the word micromanaged, but you definitely, if they're having trouble completing a task, you may want to do more consistent and regular check-ins. And I guess the only way to put that is micromanage, but I know that's definitely a turnoff for a lot of people, myself included. But as the time goes on, as you do these more regular check-ins, hopefully the person will then understand, okay, this is really important, and the behavior will change and they'll get their work done more timely. It's possible reassignment could be the best remedy. So we want our volunteers to pick a role that they feel that they would be best in and feel most comfortable. Sometimes the role that they pick isn't exactly what's going to fit them the best. And I've been guilty of this. I need some more experience in a certain area, so I'm going to volunteer for a program and try and get that experience. I may think I have the experience I need to be successful, but it turns out I'm really just hindering the progress. So it's our job to recognize their skills and what they may be better utilized for, so they can really thrive. Retrain. Some of our programs have extremely detailed training and even intense training, I would say, for our volunteers. Not everyone understands every aspect of their role after the initial training, or even after orientation and then initial training. Maybe they need to go back through and focus on a particular area. Maybe they have to go through the whole training all over again if they're really not understanding what they need to do. This is also where update training is going to prove really helpful to help people continue to grow. Even personalized one-on-one training, while it's time-consuming, could be one of the better options. Maybe even engage a seasoned volunteer that you trust and you know does exceptional work to help if your schedule doesn't allow you to provide individual one-on-one training to a volunteer who's struggling. Revitalize. We talked about this a couple months ago about burnout. Maybe a long-term volunteer is starting to show signs of burnout. You know, they've been doing the same activity for the last 3 years. It's getting a little stale. Maybe they need to be revitalized. It's okay for a volunteer to take a break. Yes, we need that. They've been coming in every Wednesday for the last year and a half, and we really hate for them to take a vacation. Or, you know, we get a lot done on those Wednesdays with that volunteer's help. Sometimes the volunteer does need to step away just for a little bit, revitalize, come back, and be even better for us. So I've probably used this example before many times, but it's just the best example that personally I've experienced and can glean from our programs. Is our SHIP and SMP program is a prime example, and the coordinators will agree with me on this, but during Medicare's open enrollment period, it's coming up in about a month, the volunteers are relied on heavily to help make sure all the clients' needs are met. Once December 8th comes around, volunteers literally disappear for a couple months. It's an intense time during that about 2-month period during open enrollment that volunteers, they take a break, we may not hear from them, and then they come back a month or 2 later, or even we have volunteers who only come back during that open enrollment period, but they're back and they're ready to work. So having that revitalization opportunity is a really good strategy. Refer. Maybe the volunteer, so they want to help achieve the mission of the program, but the spark just isn't there. No matter what you've tried to engage them in, it's just not fitting. They're not a good puzzle piece. That's okay. Maybe a referral to another program, either within your agency or in a completely different agency, is appropriate. Now, it's extremely important to note that if you refer a volunteer to another program because of a behavior issue, that can come back to bite you. You don't want to continue the cycle of bad behavior to another program. So if as a SHIP person, I'm just using examples, this is not real life scenarios, but if one of our programs, let's say the SHIP program refers a volunteer that they've been having a behavioral issue over to a senior center, and then, you know, the same issues come up to the senior center. Senior center is not going to be super duper excited that they were referred this volunteer. Now, if the program sent the volunteer over to the senior center and said, hey, just so you know, we've been trying to work with this volunteer on this, and this issue. Here's kind of the steps that we made. Here's something we would recommend to you, kind of giving them a heads up. Then, you know, the senior center or whoever is referred to may say, maybe that's not the best fit, but at least we're giving them the heads up and aren't just kind of referring someone blind who's having an issue. And last but not least, sometimes a volunteer is not able to complete or accomplish a task that they were once able to do. They've been dedicated for so long to our work, and the last thing we want to do is kind of push them out the door, fire them, remove them, whatever term you want to use. Have the conversation with them, let them know, hey, we've noticed you haven't been doing this, that, or the other. However, you know, you word it with that affirmation sandwich. Many times the volunteer feels it too. They just don't want to disappoint you, so they're not going to say, hey, I really can't volunteer anymore. They know, and you've shown them the appreciation of the importance of their work, so they don't want to let you down. But if you have that honest, open conversation, they probably do feel it as well. And then give them the send-off that they deserve, whether it's, you know, this volunteer is retiring, or, you know, just recognize them for their service and all the wonderful things that they've done for the program. So if the time comes and the decision has been made, you've exhausted all your options, you've talked to your supervisor and your legal team, gotten advice, tried all those remedies that we just talked about that could apply to the volunteer. Not all of those remedies are going to apply to every volunteer. The decision has been made that removal is the best option for the volunteer. Here are some tips to consider as the time comes. Definitely find a private place to have the conversation. You don't want to have it in an open area where other staff and volunteers can hear you. You don't want to have it in a conference room that you don't really have any privacy in. This is not something that should ever be done in a group setting or made a spectacle of. So try and get in as private of a space as you can. Having a third party present is really important. So most likely, this will probably be your supervisor or maybe a member of your legal team. You should be the one who's doing the talking, though. So even though you have your supervisor with you or a legal member with you, this is your volunteer. You know the story. You have the relationship with the volunteer and know whatever is going wrong. You know the story. This will also help if a volunteer wants to appeal their removal or test and say, I've been terminated as a volunteer wrongly, and they want to try and get back into the program. It's good to have more than just you and the volunteer witnessing the discussion. So that way you have a third party saying that they understand what happened in that meeting. Be specific. It is extremely important, again, that you don't beat around the bush and that the volunteer knows where they went wrong, and also that they know the steps that you attempted to try and correct and make the situation better. Having that documentation, that's why you have that volunteer folder, such as the role description or the policy that they may have violated. So you can point out, these are the reasons why we are going to ask you to leave the volunteer program. Emotions are going to be on high. You're going to have high emotions. It's going to be all over the place, a variety of different levels. You could get, it's important for you to keep your emotions in check as well as best as we can, but also understand that they're going to go through sort of like the stages of grief in a way, denial, I didn't do that, anger, I can't believe you're accusing me of this, bargaining, well, if I change this or this, can I stay on? And then depression, just being sad that they have to leave the program. They may do anything and everything that they can to try and change your mind and ask you for just one more chance. If you give me one more chance, I'll do better. Stay firm in your decision. There is a reason or reasons that you're in the situation in the first place. Wish them the best of luck and never attack them personally or their character. They're being asked to leave because of an action, not because of a behavior, or it's not anything personal. So make sure it's very action-based is the reason why they're being asked to be removed. One thing I personally didn't think of, and of course I say this many times in the research, I didn't really think of that, but it's really good advice, is to escort the volunteer from the premise after the meeting. Now this isn't, take them by the arm and drag them out or anything. It's, we really appreciate the service that you've done. Unfortunately, we're going to have to ask you to leave at this time, and I'm happy to escort you to the door or to the car and, wish them well that way. It may sound extreme, but you never know how a volunteer who's being removed from the program will respond. You don't want them to make a scene if a volunteer's angry, going around the office and yelling or complaining or, talking bad or whatever the scenario could be. You don't want that to happen. Follow-up is going to be key as well. So send a letter to the volunteer after the meeting to make it more of a formal process, maybe a termination letter or a volunteer removal letter, however you want to word that. Be sure to reiterate the reasons and the actions of why they were removed. It's important to also have open communication with staff, clients, and other volunteers. So you don't have to go into a whole lot of detail or anything, but let the staff, volunteers, and clients know the volunteer is no longer with the program, and instead you'll be working with so-and-so, so-and-so. This cuts way down on any gossipers that might start from, ooh, did you hear so-and-so was asked to leave because of such and such, when they really don't know the story. So being, again, open with your communication to the volunteers in a respectful way to the volunteer who was asked to leave. Again, I'm sure your legal team and your supervisor will definitely help you with the wordsmithing. I'm not the best with words. I have many, many mentors that I go to and ask Does this sound okay? How should I word this? You have a lot of resources to figure out the ways best to communicate something serious like a volunteer removal. So some takeaways, again, remember volunteer removal is the last resort after you've tired out any of those alternatives and remedies that we've talked about. Prevention, use those screening tools you have, the role descriptions, training, volunteer handbook, any of your other policies, use those to your advantage to help avoid those behaviors from coming up. Try and understand the signs of the difficult behaviors and prepare yourself for them. You don't have to be an expert in them, just kind of be aware that they may come up. And you don't have to like them, but try not to let your emotions get the best of you, or try not to imitate any kind of the emotions of the bad behavior back to the volunteers. Use the healthy ways to handle difficult volunteers and the 6 remedies before removal ideas. This will show the volunteer, your supervisor, and your legal team that this is not an impulsive decision. It's not personal. You're a good coordinator and have tried to engage this volunteer in so many different ways. And if it does have to happen and you have to make the decision with your supervisor and legal team that a volunteer needs to be removed, remember the tips that we just talked about and how to conduct that meeting. And it's important that this is done in person, and never terminate a volunteer over email. This needs to be hopefully a face-to-face meeting, maybe a conference call with COVID stuff, but it needs to be done more personally than just an email. So we did have a couple questions come in. What do you do when a volunteer is being reviewed, meeting about a problem or complaint, and they refuse to sign paperwork showing that they were talked to, acknowledge what they did wrong, but they feel the word is good enough and they won't sign it? That's a really good step I didn't even think about. This is something you should definitely talk to your legal team about and see if it's something that they say, you know, you have to sign this, maybe even get them involved in talking with the volunteer and saying, hey, if you want to continue volunteering with us, you need to sign this document. And it's possible that your legal advice could say, well, you know, it's not an official document of the organization. It is just kind of notes. If they don't want to sign it, they're within their rights not to sign it. But make sure you note that in your notes. The volunteer was asked to sign this document about the corrective action, about kind of the scenario, however you want to word that, and just make a note that volunteer refused to sign. So I don't know the legal ramifications on if they do or don't, but definitely making a note is a really good idea. Great question. All right, so that is all for the content of the Can You Fire a Volunteer? I got about 11 minutes left in our time, so I hope everyone will still stick with me just for a few more minutes, a couple other things to go over. Thank you to everyone who completed the webinar survey last month. Kind of a new thing that we started to get some feedback about the webinars and if they're good, bad, how I can improve, and things of that nature. I received a lot of great feedback, and I'm happy that you guys are enjoying the feedback options, the polls, the myths and truths that we did last month. So I'm going to try and keep incorporating those in every presentation. 3 of you responded to me with some good news stories that I wanted to share with everyone. So if you haven't shared your good news stories and thought, maybe you should just read them and that'll be the end of that. Nope, I don't know. The surveys are anonymous, so I don't know who submitted them, but I am going to share some good news stories. And I hope throughout these webinars I'll be able to share more and more. So we have some go-getters. One of your fellow volunteer coordinators said, although during this time of COVID, we've seen a decrease in volunteer availability, some volunteers are becoming go-getters and overachievers. They are people that want to stay engaged, and we appreciate that so much. I think a lot of us can relate to that we've seen a decrease in volunteers due to COVID, but those volunteers that stick around, man, they're really picking up, I don't want to say picking up the slack, but they're really helping fill in the gaps that may have been caused by some volunteers dropping out or suspending, I should say, their volunteer activity during this time. Great example. We have some givers. So a volunteer that, or one of our coordinators has a volunteer that has sent cards or little gifts each month during the pandemic to a person that she was assigned to. So it sounds like it's a kind of a pals or a buddies volunteer role, and they've really been able to thrive in that area. So that's really, really great. I want to be that person's buddy. And then we have some people who are taking on more roles and more responsibility, similar to those go-getters. We've had many volunteers who've stepped up from the My Ride program and have started helping deliver meals. Our meal delivery has really increased because of COVID, and our volunteers have been amazing in helping both programs. So not only as a volunteer who was in one program, they've offered to pick up and help with additional programs needs. So these are some really great stories, and I appreciate you all sharing, and I hope we get more good news stories as we do the surveys again. I do want to make one more, well, probably make more than one, but another plug for the Make a Difference Monday. So I can't thank you all enough for your support in this campaign. We've recognized volunteers from My Ride and Volunteer Assisted Transportation programs, the SHIP S&T program, our nutrition programs, whether that be the meal delivery, helping with meal preparation. Some of our senior centers have submitted folks, our guardianship program, the SAIL program, and our local area agencies on aging and disability. As of today, and I've kind of posted a couple examples of some of those volunteers' submissions, we've received 45 submissions, which is phenomenal. Now, as you can see, some posts recognize more than one volunteer, so it's even more than 45 individuals. That means we have volunteers ready to be highlighted from the first Monday in January through October 26th. So we have 9 more Mondays that we need submissions for in order to have a complete year of volunteer recognition through this Make a Difference Monday campaign. I know we can do it. There's a form that I'll include in each of the follow-up emails from the webinar. It's hard for people to complete the form since it's in a PDF. So I understand that, and that may be a turnoff to some of the volunteers from submitting their information. So hopefully to help, the volunteer can answer the questions maybe in the body of an email, if you wanted to maybe call them and kind of fill it out for them. But we also need kind of written permission. So maybe they'll type you, yes, I give you permission to use my story and my picture in an email. I'm going to reach out to a few of our volunteers in our new programs that we've started since COVID. So this campaign can highlight individuals or groups of volunteers if you wanted to highlight maybe your board of directors or a dedicated group that really stepped up during COVID. Many, many different options. It doesn't just have to be one person. So I hope you'll join me, and let's see if we can make it a year of volunteer recognition, and hopefully we can continue this campaign into 2021. So I really appreciate y'all's support in this campaign. It's been really great. We get a lot of positive responses and views on these posts. I always like to share with you all the numbers that have been reported for our volunteer campaign. So in the first 9 months, give or take, from January, 2,924 volunteers have been reported throughout all of our programs. So we're almost hitting the 3,000 person mark, volunteer mark. Our goal was 2020, so we shattered that through the roof, which is amazing. And we have over 83,000 hours of volunteer activity that's been reported. So last month, I kind of broke this down into the different programs so everyone can kind of see how many volunteers have been reported. The effort in reporting data and collecting this data is ongoing throughout the year. So if you're interested in having your numbers continue to be calculated to show our amazing volunteer efforts across the state for all of our programs, please feel free to either shoot me an email, let me know your volunteer work, or there's also a section on the webinar survey where you can report some data. Whatever's easiest for you, just trying to give you multiple options to consider. And then lastly, before we kind of log off and I ask for questions, Please complete the webinar survey for me. I love getting the feedback. Again, the good news stories were a great addition to the webinars. Those of you who've suggested topics is really helping me in the planning process for the webinar series for next year. I'm hoping that you all want these webinars to continue. If not, let me know. If you do, let me know. But you do have the link to the webinar in the email I sent yesterday, and I will also include it in the follow-up email that I will hopefully send this afternoon once I post the recording of the webinar on our YouTube channel. So even if you are watching via YouTube, please fill out the survey and give me some of your feedback. Our next webinar is going to be Friday, October 16th, same time, same place, wherever you're at, maybe home, maybe your office. And we're going to talk about volunteer risk management, the policies and procedures that, as I was getting questions during the presentation, I realized this probably should have been the September webinar and maybe the Can You Fire a Volunteer being October's webinar. But I hope you all will join us next month. I'll stick around for some questions. We have about 3 minutes left in our time. And thank you all so much, as always, for listening to me ramble on and on. I hope I've kept your attention and kept you engaged. And here's my contact information if you want to reach out to me one-on-one. So I appreciate all of you again, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.